my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and I'm doing a combined wrap-up today for the months of January and February, during which I read a total of only 5 books, which may be not very much by booktube standards, but by normal person standards, that's a lot of books. So I'm taking it as a win. The first book I want to talk about is The Voyages of Synrak, the Dapper by A.J. Fitzwater, which is a collection of connected stories published in 2020 that is one of the books by New Zealand authors that I purchased after Virtual Con Zealand last summer. This is set in a world that has anthropomorphic animal characters. Cinrak is a lesbian capybara pirate captain. There are some ways in which this collection of stories exceeded my expectations for it based on this premise, and other ways in which I felt disappointed by it. I ended up giving it 3 stars. I think that some of the things that stood out to me were the whimsy of this world and the sort of vivid beauty of it, as well as the undercurrent throughout of radical acceptance and found family and joy. The author's introduction to this book starts out with the declaration that joy is political. And specifically, they're talking about queer joy in a world that wants to curtail that joy. And this is a statement that I can really jive with as like the basis for a pirate book. I personally have strong preferences in terms of what pirate books I like and don't like, specifically I think in terms of fantasy. I really like pirate stories that sort of focus on the enchantment and allure of at-sea adventures and the rebelliousness of going against the status quo without dealing with like the shitty reality of actual piratehood, which is not fun. The adventures themselves are full of magic and the mysteries of the deep. I think where this book falls short for me is in its structure. There's not much variety in the format of these stories. A significant number of them follow a format where we're sort of introduced to the characters of the story, some sort of quest or adventure or other mission is presented. The mechanics of the quest are kind of glossed over in a sometimes very confusing way, and it all leads to this beautiful magical climax. There's nothing wrong with this format if you're publishing stories individually, but in aggregate it gets a little repetitive. The other structural complaint here is that I'm not sure the order of the stories worked for me. This is told chronologically from the beginning of Cinrak's life to the end where she's a more mature pirate. That's the obvious choice, but I'm not sure it's the strongest one that could have actually been made in terms of hooking the reader. The 2 previously published stories in this collection, The Wild Ride of Untamed Stars and Search for the Heart of the Ocean, are stories 3 and 4 in this collection, and I think they work pretty well on their own as a 1-2 punch of a short story and its sequel. The Wild Ride of Untamed Stars was published in Beneath Ceaseless Skies in 2018. It's free to read online, so I will link it. It's the one story in this collection that you can read for free somewhere on the internet. It was really a highlight of this collection for me. It's an adventure not on sea, but on the land, and in it Cinrak is participating in a competition to win the favor of the Rat Queen, who is one of her 2 lovers. There is this cute poly trio between Cinrak, the Rat Queen, and a marmot opera singer, and I don't think we get nearly enough of them in this book. This is one of the few stories where the 3 of them get significant page time together. This competition that Cinrak participates in is a race to harness and ride a shooting star. And just that very premise provides such a clear snapshot of the nature of the magic in this world. And then the search for the heart of the ocean is more of a traditional seafaring pirate tale that introduces 2 great recurring characters, Benj, who is Cinrak's chinchilla trans cabin boy, and Agnes, who is a kraken. And the specific details of the quest of this one does follow upon the events of the previous story. These 2 were such a step up from me from the first 2 stories in the collection, which actually left me quite confused about the nature of this fantasy world and not yet hooked on the characters. The first story, Young Cinrak, in which Cinrak is a young orphan girl who decides to leave home to become a pirate, feels very much like a prequel giving us some of the backstory of an already fan favorite character, and it didn't work for me as an introduction to her. I also think there were some seriously missed opportunities to do some, like, world building stealthy info dump that would have really helped me get my bearing and figure out what type of fantasy story I was dealing with here. In the first story, it's clear that, like, yes, this is an anthropomorphic animal world, but the magic isn't really introduced. This is a world that has the animal people, but also societies of mythic fantasy creatures. I mentioned the Kraken previously. There are mer people, there are fairies, there is a lot going on. It's way more heightened fantasy than what you would get any sense of from this first story. Cinrak herself also has a magical gift. She has a minor gift for weather magic that makes her very well suited to a life on the sea. And that does come up in this story, but not in a way where I, reading it without any prior knowledge, had any understanding that this was literally a magical gift and not just like, oh, she has the salt, it's the talent, the sea sings to her or something. And so come the second story, where the climax of that one ends up hinging on Cinrak literally having this magical talent, I felt really stupid because I hadn't understood that before, and it was suddenly all important. Because again, nothing in that first story had really clued me into the fact that magical gifts were a thing that commonly exist in this universe. The second story, Perfidy at the Philidae Isles, was equally puzzling to me. It is the story that sort of shows us a snapshot of Cinrak as a young captain, newly come into this role as captain of her own ship and all of that new responsibility. It centers around Cinrak aiding in negotiations between the rodent queendom and this island cat nation. And again, because I didn't really have an understanding of what was important in general in these stories and this world, yet I went into it reading for the wrong things. I was trying to figure out what was going on with the politics and the actual, like, negotiations between the rodent country and the cat country, which is not explained. I assumed that this was somehow going to be important going forward. It is not. We do get a clear sense of some of the, magical inhabitants of this world. There's a Phoenix character who delivers prophecies that, like, something's going to go very badly and there's going to be a betrayal at these negotiations. Her name is Muriel, and in retrospect, I am puzzled that she was a one-off character for this one story and never showed up again. Really, I think this is just backstory for the aforementioned poly-trio romantic relationship, because this is the first time that Cinrak meets the newly crowned young rat queen Orvilia. So I've touched a bit on the first 4 stories. There are 3 more following. Those are the Hirsute Pursuit, Cetaceous Secrets of the Jeweled Nadir, and Flight of the Hydrochorus. And I do think that all 3 of those build upon characters and storylines introduced in earlier stories in ways where I wouldn't recommend reading any of those on their own. They do have to follow the ones that come before. This is getting sort of long, so I don't feel the need to go into the details of any of those later stories, but 3 stars out of 5 for the Voyages of Synrak the Dapper. Whoops, I forgot to switch my mass market face out. Fixed that. The next book I want to talk about is Desdemona and the Deep, which is a fantasy novella by C.S.E. Cooney. Like the Voyages of Synrak the Dapper, the main appeal of this book for me ended up being some of that very heightened, whimsical fantasy writing. The writing style of this at times reminded me of, like, some of the more fairy tale-ish work of Catherine M. Valenti, although possibly with prose that's a little less dense, the sort of, like, off-the-wall imagination of the types of characters and creatures and landscapes that can appear. In some ways, this is a portal fantasy, although it differs from sort of the classics of that genre, in that it does start in a secondary fantasy world setting, and the two magical realms that the protagonist Desdemona travels through on her journey are known of in this world, even if they're considered to be myth and legend. Also, Desdemona definitely goes on this journey that she goes on purpose. She doesn't accidentally tumble down a rabbit hole or take up a random opportunity to be whisked away. So to back up to the beginning, this takes place in a fantasy world setting that has a very 19th century industrialization thing going on. Desdemona is a young woman who is a socialite and an heiress. Her parents are no longer together, and she's not particularly close with either of them. Her father owns, I guess, an energy company, and her mother is essentially a high-profile socialite activist for workers' rights in a way that frankly feels performative and unhelpful. I think Desdemona starts off as being distinctly unlikable in a lot of ways. She seems really superficial and self-centered, and she's not a particularly nice person. The book opens at like this big glitzy fundraising gala that her mom is organizing to like raise money for a hospital ward for these factory worker women who are suffering this terrible medical condition from their work. And a lot of things about this scenario are very grating and don't endear us to Desdemona at all. The thing about Desdemona, though, that makes her a really interesting protagonist is that when she decides she wants something, she can be absolutely ruthless in getting it. She ends up overhearing her father having a conversation with essentially this goblin king that it turns out he has a contract with, where he essentially offers a number of the workers from his coal mine as a tithe to the goblin realm in exchange for oil to be discovered at this property he's acquired. And her father decides to cover up the disappearance of these miners by basically staging a mining accident that's going to kill everyone else in the mine. Desdemona is rightly horrified when she later learns that this has actually happened. The mining accident that she overheard her father planning has happened. Lots of people have died, and because she knew about it in advance and did nothing, she feels like she is complicit. And she decides that she needs to figure out how to travel through these realms of myth and legend to bargain with the Goblin King to get the workers back that her father bargained away. There are 3 different realms in this cosmology, and they are all connected by the house, the mansion that Desdemona's family owns that she grew up in, that is in all 3 realms a seat of power. There's the mortal world and 2 realms below it. The first realm below is the land of the gentry, which I would say are approximately equivalents to like the Fae. And then the realm below that is the goblin realm. And as she goes on her journey through these realms, Desdemona is transformed both metaphorically and literally. Along with her on this journey is her best friend Chaz, who sort of gets dragged along on accident. And Chaz, Desdemona comes to learn, is a trans woman. That relationship is really interesting, how Desdemona in some ways just like fundamentally does understand her best friend, and in other ways sort of has to learn to be supportive rather than selfish in that relationship. So obviously the wild fantasy adventure of the quest appealed to me immensely, as did some of the social commentary. There's also a good deal about art and artists in this that I just really enjoyed. I also really liked the ending, because it comes to a point where you feel like that is the ending of the fantasy quest story, and then there is this extra bit of story beyond that that is just an incredibly satisfying ending for Desdemona. I gave this 4 stars. This is, in fact, even though it was published as a standalone by Tor.com, Cooney's 3rd novella set in this world, and I read this as a standalone on its own. It works perfectly well, but I did go back and check those previous 2 novellas are self-published, and I think they do feature some characters who appear in this, so thinking about this as a loose series, I am maybe interested in going back and then reading those first 2 books. I think there may also be some other short fiction she's written set in this world. I had never read anything by C.S.E. Cooney before picking up this book, but I did go into it with very high expectations, thinking that she might become a new favorite author for me. I still feel very optimistic on that regard. I look forward to reading more of her work. I gave this 4 stars. Next is the first of 2 different C.L. Polk books I read in the month of February. This is Stormsong, which is the sequel to Witchmark. This is the middle book of the Kingston cycle, which is a trilogy. The 3rd book, Soulstar, was just recently released, but I haven't gotten my hands on a copy of it yet. This is another fantasy book where the protagonist is like a difficult, prickly, young, high society lady in a world with social injustice that is at least in part due to industrialization. It has a bit of the same glitz and glam feel as Desdemona in the Deep, so it was a nice carryover from my previous read. I have a review of Witchmark on my channel, so I can link that for you. But I will say, I think the one mistake I made with this series is I waited too long to pick up book 2, and I really should have reread Witchmark before going into this, because there are a lot of little threads of plot and world building going on here that I was not quite up to speed on everything that was happening, and this book does just dump you right in where the first book left off without stopping to remind you what happened in the previous one at all. In addition, there is a point of view switch. Miles was the protagonist in Witchmark. The protagonist of Stormsong is Grace. It is first-person narration for both books. And I think I thought I remembered Witchmark well enough because I had such strong, vivid, fuzzy memories of certain important parts of that story that were emotionally significant. But with the switch to Grace's point of view, I feel like different threads of the plot become the most important ones. And specifically, I realized I remembered very little from book 1 about Grace's, wealthy and powerful social cohort. There were a number of characters that I suspect I probably should have remembered from book 1, and what their relationships were with Grace that I really didn't remember at all. This was frustrating for me because other than the points on which I was confused, I absolutely adored this book, and I felt like it might have been a 5-star read if I had done the right thing and gone back and reread Witchmark. So in terms of what's going on with the plot, there's a lot I can't say without spoiling book 1. Book 1 had a mix of really quite magic system heavy fantasy world building along with a queer romance, and a murder mystery. It takes place in the city of Kingston, where the title of the series comes from, which is the capital of a country called Ayland. And over the course of book 1, there was a greater government conspiracy in the nation of Ayland that gradually came to light. It had to do with a war they had fought and won, oppression against people of the lower classes who are born with magical ability, the means by which Ayland was attaining basically its source of electrical power, and a touch of basically necromancy. So at the beginning of this book, we have a situation where the otherworldly beings that I keep switching when reading these books between thinking of them as an equivalent to angels and equivalent to the Fae. They're a lot like the Fae, but their world is tied to religion and the afterlife, and they have some of the moral authority over the humans that imparts. But basically, the otherworldly delegation have arrived to try to negotiate the terms of Ayland's penance for all of its crimes. So there's a big political reckoning going on for what was happening in book 1, but it's all happening sort of behind the scenes in secret, and the government really doesn't want any of it to get out. With all of these guilty parties in prison, Grace has risen to her father's government position of chancellor, serving the queen, and she is torn between a bunch of different loyalties. The queen, who she technically serves the prince who might be plotting something, the otherworldly delegation and her brother with them, with whom she personally agrees in their condemnation of the moral atrocities that have occurred. And then there is also this plucky lady reporter, Avia Jessup, or it might be Avia, I'm going with Avia, who is relentless in pursuit of the truth and believes that the people deserve to know everything. Something that Grace is very, very hesitant about. It's a little hard to sympathize with her on this, but she really does believe that if the public were to know everything, there would be chaos in the streets. It would literally be the end of the nation at a time when there is also like an infrastructure disaster and an impending magical climate catastrophe. I did say there's a lot going on in this book. There is a lot. There is another murder mystery that happens in this, but it doesn't show up until maybe about a third of the way into the book, and it isn't as big a part of the plot as the murder mystery in book 1 was. Each of the books in this series has a queer romance, and I do feel like the romance was a smaller part of this book than it was in book 1. I feel like Avia as a love interest just has less page time. Less of Grace's story centers around her relationship with Avia than Miles and Tristan in book 1. And part of that is just that there is so much going on in this book that like both the murder and the romance had to take a little bit of a backseat. But I do like the romance in this. Avia is someone who also came from privilege but has sort of gotten out and made her own life for herself that is not the life that her father wanted for her, and Grace sort of envies that. They obviously both admire each other incredibly, but there's a bit of this trust issue of whether or not Grace can trust Avia with all of these government secrets that are weighing on her shoulders, knowing that Avia wants to, you know, put them in the press. So I would say overall so far from books 1 and 2, this series has so much going for it. There are all of these themes about power and privilege. There are all of these like genre and world building elements going on. There are mysteries, there's romance. There is, in this book at least, like vast amounts of political intrigue that wasn't necessarily in book 1. And it's all written in a very accessible, easy to read writing style. This is just easy writing to fall into. So I highly recommend this series. I gave this 4 stars, which is the same rating I gave the first one. I did mention, though, if I had read them back to back, this might have been 5. The next book I read was Babel 17 by Samuel R. Delaney, which I read on ebook from my library. This is a science fiction classic from the 70s, and I technically read this as part of a group read with a number of other booktube friends, but I didn't finish this until well after everyone else had already finished it and like finished discussing it, so I sort of missed out there. I actually started it back in October and was just having a very hard time getting over the hump of the first few chapters. I eventually let my library loan expire. It went back to the library. I had to get it back later. But then the second time in February, I got back into reading it. I felt like it was much smoother sailing for me. This is essentially a military SF mystery novel that hinges on some speculative extrapolation from some linguistics concepts. There's a cat here now. She kept knocking at the tripod, so she's here now. The protagonist is a woman named Rydra Wong, who is a famous poet, but she basically has like linguistic superpowers. It's never really explained the source of her extreme language powers. She's super crazy good at learning and understanding languages, and to the point where like she can interpret body language as like an actual language, practically to the point of telepathy. And her poetry is actually based on what she has gleaned from like the minds of others by observing them. But she is approached by the military to crack what they think is a code that they've intercepted, and she looks at this and says, no, this is not a code. This is in fact an entire language, and it's a freaking weird one. The language is called Babel 17. She puts together a crew for a spaceship and goes off in search of the answers about this language. And I think my main problem with this book, the thing that kept me from loving it, even though I really liked some of the ideas and the way that it used some linguistics concepts in like a speculative way, was that there were just all of these little things along the way that for various reasons kept like tripping me up or putting a slightly sour taste in my mouth. A little bit of this is stuff that's aged poorly. There is, for example, one chapter in which there is some really egregiously gross fat phobia in how Rydra perceives one minor side character. But a lot of it was sort of just the ways that this book is sometimes stylistically weird when I didn't feel like it needed to be. What was specifically so hard for me to get into about the first few chapters is that they're all told from a perspective of minor, unimportant characters who are not Rydra in their interactions with her. And so your introduction to this character is all of these other people's sort of weird impressions of her. We spend a while at the beginning following as she puts together her crew for this space mission. And while I actually liked all of the characters in her crew in later chapters, there were some things about those scenes that put me off. But then after those early chapters, you settle into the majority of the book, which is in Rydra's POV, and I was much more comfortable reading from her perspective. She's a great protagonist. I actually ended up liking her a lot. Now, this was the first time I'd ever read anything by Delaney, and I knew going in that he's an author who is known for some of his sort of weird, stylistically heightened writing. Mostly, I just found this book to be really elegantly written in a way I actually enjoyed the prose style of, but then it does just get a little weird occasionally. And again, I didn't feel like this particular story needed that. It's a pretty straightforward space adventure mystery. Rydra solves a number of problems along the way with, you know, various linguistics concepts that she manages to apply in unconventional ways. The backdrop of this story is this space war where basically, you know, the invaders are attacking the, you know, union of peoples that includes Earth. And we're sort of to understand that there's a very basic, you know, space colonization, lots of planets out there thing going on. And the war is kind of like any other space war. But it does manage to philosophize on the way a bit about the morality of war and how people in this war end up justifying their actions. So this one was sort of a mixed bag for me. It does actually come back in the end, interestingly, to some of the perspectives, the POV characters who were introduced at the beginning of the book, and you sort of see how their interactions with Rydra way back at the beginning changed their outlook on life, probably for the better, how she's sort of broadened their minds. And that was actually a nice uplifting note to end on. It made me feel more warmly about those early chapters than I did at the time I read them. There are some things about this science fiction world, though, that just aren't explained. Like, there are people who are discorporate and they're dead, they're ghosts, but it's sort of implied that there must be a science fiction basis for this. It's not like fantasy magic ghosts. But that was a weird thing that I didn't know why it was there. Like, I don't really know what the purpose was of having dead people on your spaceship crew other than that they communicate differently. That was one of just those sort of out there things that I didn't feel there was enough payoff to introducing and trying to get us on board with this entire strange concept. So I had a very mixed experience with this book. I gave it 3 stars. I'm glad I've read it. I'm glad to have read something by Delaney. This is the book of his that I was previously interested in reading. I've read it now and I don't really feel like I need to read anything else by him. And then the last book I read a print copy of from the library and have since returned it. This is The Midnight Bargain, the second book in the month of February that I read by C.L. Polk. This one is a standalone, and it is a fantasy of manners. It's really a classic fantasy of manners in the sense that it has to do with courtship and romance in a very structured society. It has that sort of Regency romance feel, even though the world of this book, that's a secondary fantasy world, isn't directly based on the Regency in terms of like costuming or politics or government, as far as I can tell. This is a world in which some people are born with magic and they are sorcerers and sorceresses, and some are not. And it's a world with very strict gender roles. Our protagonist is Beatrice, a young lady who is one of the upper class sorceresses who is expected to have a bargaining season where they get married off, and upon marriage they will have a collar put on them that restricts their magic, because it is very dangerous for sorceresses to become pregnant, because the practice of magic in this world hinges in part upon spirits and the summoning of spirits. And spirits want to possess human bodies so they can experience the world, so they will possess the unborn children of sorceresses. And that is just a disaster and a tragedy all around when that happens. But sorceresses, especially upper class ones, are still in demand as wives in high society because of their ability to pass on their powers to male offspring. So if you are a sorcerer, you want a sorceress for a wife so that you can continue your family line of sorcerers. If you are not a sorcerer, if you're just a well-to-do nobleman, you might want to introduce sorcery into your family lineage. So Beatrice is a merchant's daughter. The sorcery in her family comes from her mother's side, not her father's. And she has been brought to town for this bargaining season because her father is really counting on being able to make a good match for her to save their family's fortunes, so that then her younger sister can also have a bargaining season. That is what her younger sister has always dreamed of. But Beatrice loves magic. She's been practicing it in secret, and she doesn't want to give it up. She would rather use her magic to help her father make better business choices, because her father makes terrible business choices, which is why they are in this situation in the first place. And she believes if she can learn how to complete what's called the Great Bargain, which is a bargain with a greater powerful spirit, before she has to get married, her father will have no choice but to accept that this is obviously the better choice for the family to rescue their fortunes. What she does not bargain for, is that she might fall in love. Her love interest, Ianthe, is sort of too good to be true. He is wildly wealthy and he respects her immensely. There are so many ways in which this would be the best possible match for her, but there is still no way for her to have it all, including her magic. Or is there? I was, of course, comparing this as I was reading it pretty directly to Stormsong, which was the other C.L. Polk book that I had just read. And it is a little more surface level than Stormsong. I think that goes with the territory a bit of Stormsong being a sequel that dives deeper into all sorts of plot lines, politics, world building in that world than this standalone that is essentially like a Fantasy of Manners romance is even trying to do. I think there are some similarities you see though in Polk's world building. Their magic systems tend to raise questions about power imbalances in society. The magic system is again fairly complex. It takes place in one country, but you get the sense that there's a lot of cultural variation if you were to travel around this world, and that's something that the characters are aware of, and it has an impact on this setting. So I think you can definitely tell that they're by the same author. I definitely categorize this as Fantasy of Manners, whereas the Kingston Cycle not so much, because the Kingston Cycle does involve a lot of political intrigue and basically questions about government that this book doesn't really touch on. You don't really learn much about how the country that this takes place in is run. You don't learn that much about the role of sorcerers in society, although there are some interesting, tantalizing hints about some of the possibilities. You don't really see a lot of what people use magic for in this world more broadly than like what Beatrice and some of the other characters want to use it for. It is very much focused on the mechanics of Beatrice's bargaining season, the events she has to go to, how she's supposed to behave at these events, what happens when she fails to meet those expectations, and what the consequences are with her family members and society, and this other family, her love interest's family, with whom she gets quite involved. She becomes very close with both Ianthe and his sister, Isbeta. And Beatrice's relationship with Isbeta is almost more interesting than her relationship with Ianthe. Isbeta is also trying to learn magic to get out of an arranged marriage. And they are both trying to learn these secrets that are encoded secretly in books of magic written by and for women that are disguised as other books. They're trying to find these grimoires and study this alternate path that is potentially available to them, even though the official institutions of sorcery are only open to men. They meet because they both show up in this used bookshop trying to buy the same magic book. And then they build this contentious relationship around meeting to like discuss magic in secret and share knowledge. That is a difficult relationship because they each feel like they need this knowledge more than the other for various reasons, but there's enough nuance in their dynamic that it never falls into really like stereotypes of catty women fighting with each other. Isbeta has more lofty goals than Beatrice, who really was just trying to think of like saving her family's circumstances and keeping magic for herself, whereas Isbeta has grand ambitions of traveling the world and learning alternate methods of sorcery and preventing them from being lost to history. And this relationship challenges Beatrice and her ideas of what she wants in life and why she wants it and what she might aim for, in the same way that Beatrice challenges a lot of Ianthe's notions about the world and society and what is right and what is fair. So I gave this 4 stars, which is the same rating I gave Stormsong. I don't think I loved it as much. It is just not quite as ambitious a book, and I feel like a bit of a hypocrite saying that because I usually talk so much about how I like standalones that are self-contained and don't need to be big and ambitious to pay off, and Stormsong is as complex as it is because it's a sequel. So I don't know what to say to you about that, but that's how I feel. Anyhow, that's all. Those are the books I read in January and February. Let me know if you've read any of them or if you're planning to. Let me know what you think. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.